Welcome everybody to today's Lunch and Learn. We did an earlier one of these with RBB, and the topic then was IoT in a low volume, high mix world, and what are some of the topics and issues that need to be concerned, you need to be concerned with in that world. Today's topic is something that's extremely relevant, very poignant with all you have to do is look in the news every day and you'll see issues such as cybersecurity issues almost in the news every day. And so that's what we're going to be talking here this afternoon. So I'd like to welcome you to that. And I'd like to thank RBB for allowing us the opportunity to provide this presentation. The issue of cybersecurity, of course, is a huge one. There are a lot of facets to it. There's not a lot of time to go through that in a lunch and learn in excruciating detail, but our hope is to really focus today's discussion on what are some of the things that are really germane to a contract manufacturer. You as an OEM or a provider of goods to the marketplace may be working with a contract manufacturer, and if you are providing connected devices, you need to be concerned about certain things, and that's what our topic is here today. So we've broken our presentation. Next slide, please. We've broken our presentation from an agenda standpoint into two parts. Part one is really an IoT security overview, just so we're on the same page. We'll talk a little bit, what are the risks of a breach? What are some of the vulnerabilities that are commonly out there? There are regulations that are emerging from various bodies. We'll talk about that, and an understanding of the life cycle and ecosystem in which a cybersecurity program needs to reside. Second part of our discussion then will be getting down to some brass tacks, and that will be some of the keys in how to manufacture secure products. We'll talk a little bit about the security life cycle, what the role of the contract manufacturer is in that, and then a concept of zero trust manufacturing. We'll talk a little bit about that and how that can be employed to thwart the risks of security issues. Last couple of things we'll do is we'll talk about a real world example, show you a board with different programmable things on it, and what process is necessary from a manufacturing perspective to make sure that that board, when it's shipped, is secure and can be trusted. Next slide, please. So it's no secret that the emergence of the IoT is here. The train has left the station, and the number of devices is really just transforming industry. So every industry that you can imagine, everyone and everything is being affected by this transformation. Sometimes it's little simple consumer apps, sometimes it's very complex things that are being transformed by IoT. It's estimated, various estimates are out there, but it's estimated that there are perhaps 46 billion connected devices that will be out there by the close of this calendar year. That estimate, other estimates are showing that is forecast to grow to as much as 125 billion devices by the close of the decade. So the benefits of IoT are real. IoT systems are making people safer, improving medical outcomes, improving the planet, water quality, air quality, the way we grow our food. All of these things. So those benefits are very real and they're quantifiable. But unfortunately, with any advancement, it also comes with risks. And those are also very real and very quantifiable. Next slide, please. As an example, three things from the news. Philips just a few days ago released a study that finds that hospitals are struggling to manage the thousands of devices throughout their hospital. Truly half of respondents felt like they didn't have sufficient budget to manage the devices that are around their hospital. And we know that our hospitals are one of those institutions that are ripe for these kinds of attacks that we're starting to see. Second one we've listed there is Peloton. Last spring had a faulty API that let anybody be able to grab a user's private data, including things like weight, gender, whether someone was in the room exercising, other, personal statistics and things. So that was as a result of a faulty API. Last item we cited there, this is a lovely one. A casino gets hacked through a fish tank thermometer. And the pathway on that was in through the fish tank thermometer, around the system a little bit, and I think it went out the thermostat to a secure database, ended up going out the thermostat. So those are the kind of threats that we're up against these days, unfortunately. So the impacts of a security breach could be quite significant. It could damage the company's reputation and the market value if it's a public company. You may lose customers, and it'd be very expensive to reacquire those customers. It could drive support costs beyond what they were budgeted to be. It could lead to product recalls or returns. It could be a loss of intellectual property. Someone could just come in and steal your intellectual property. It's estimated that the US alone loses about $600 billion a year to intellectual property theft alone. And then of course, there can also be legal liability associated with a security breach. So it's very important to address these issues. What I'd like to do is I'd like to have David Rogers, our IoT systems architect, now talk a little bit about some of the security vulnerabilities that we see out there. So David, would you like to go through some of those?
Certainly.
Next slide, please. There.
I'm going to try not to get too technical on these. This should be at a level that pretty much everyone ought to be able to understand. Two basic terms that I want to define before I go into this. There is encryption and there is authentication. And it's important to draw a distinction between those two things. Encryption is simply making sure that someone cannot read or access data that is not intended for them. So you use some type of cipher so that the data, whether it's in transit through a network, whether it's at rest in a memory device or on a disk, someone can't just come along and get that raw data and be able to access it. So for over a network, for instance, you would often use you hear about secure websites. All that means is you're using TLS, transport layer security, to have a secure connection between your computer and that remote web server, so that no one in the middle is able to inspect that data and extract information. As long as you're using secure HTTP, your ISP shouldn't be able to snoop your traffic and get advertising revenue off of that. That's in contrast to authentication. And that is the practice of making sure that you have verified the identity of some remote party. In your web browser, you do this all the time when you're browsing websites. You browse to pretty much any website these days is going to be a secure site, and it's going to present a security certificate that says, I am CNN.com or I am Google.com. And cryptographically, you can verify that that certificate was signed by a trusted authority that says, yeah, this was definitely signed by a trusted authority, and this certificate says this website is who they say they are. But you can also turn that around, especially in the IoT world. You want to know that some remote IoT device that is connected to your system is in fact who they say they are. So there are various means of having devices and systems authenticate each other so that you can know the identity of that remote device, and then you use encryption to protect all that data that you're actually exchanging. And the combination of those two is necessary to have a truly secure system. Now, what are some of the ways that this system can be weakened? One means is simply having weak or no means of authentication. There are numerous horror stories about various systems that have honestly very little to no authentication for their systems. The Peloton example that you described, that's one example of many cases where a company stands up some service in the cloud, but really doesn't properly vet the requests that are being made against that API, maybe they assume that it was going to be one of their other internal systems querying that system, and they don't bother to validate that it's the person requesting that information is actually authorized to receive that. As far as end devices go, you can have things like hard-coded credentials. Your Wi-Fi routers of the past, a Wi-Fi router in a sense is kind of an IoT device. And older models of routers, they'd always have a sticker on the back that says, your basic login is admin, your password is admin. And if the user does not go and change that name and password, guess what? That's that's a default credential, but you can also have hard-coded credentials where there's some backdoor account that has been baked into the device. This has happened with a number of other brands of network routers where this secret backdoor account has suddenly been discovered, and once that is known, it's game over. Any device of that type can be compromised. Shared keys. If you have a system where every device within a system uses the same key to, for instance, access the cloud, if one device is compromised and an attacker is able to gain that key, then they're in. It's not that they can only pretend to be that one device. If there's only one key necessary, they have it and your system is open. Unprotected keys. Just because you've embedded some credentials in a device doesn't mean that those credentials are secure. You can read out flash memory devices. You can take a disk, disconnect the disk from the system and just dump out the contents of the disk, sift through the contents and find encryption keys. So whenever you store cryptographic credentials, you have to make sure that they're stored in a way that someone can't gain physical or even remote custody of the device and be able to extract those credentials out of the device. And then also an important one is weak algorithms that are securing various services. Over time, obviously, better and better encryption and authentication algorithms have been developed, partly because it's been out of necessity. Older encryption, such as DES, which for many years was the federal standard for encryption, and other ciphers, have been deprecated because you can now fairly inexpensively purchase some time on a cloud system and crack those encryptions with a few $1,000s worth of compute time. Similarly, certain hash algorithms for verifying passwords like SHA-1 are deprecated because, again, it now requires a relatively trivial amount of processing power to crack those algorithms. So you have to make sure that not only are you implementing authentication and encryption, but you're implementing them up to modern standards that aren't aren't flimsy from a technical standpoint. So yeah, I mentioned the outdated standards. Yeah, and the MD5 and SHA-1 checksums are kind of pointless at this point because it is relatively easy to calculate a. I won't get into the technicalities of faking hashes, but there are much more secure algorithms with better algorithms, more bits that make sure that it would take a non-trivial amount of time for someone to try and crack. Maybe a nation state would be able to devote tons of resources to decrypt one thing. If that's what it takes to crack something, be fairly certain that your stuff is relatively secure. Same for encryption. You have to make sure that you are using a modern algorithm and that you're using you have enough bits in the key to assure yourself that for the application that you're putting out, there's no reasonable chance that someone could devote enough processing resources to crack that encryption.
And that's one of the risks, of course, of leaving old devices in the field without updating their firmware. And this is it's almost a growing liability.
Yeah, and I'll talk about automated firmware updates and why they're important. It's also important to think about from a hardware standpoint. Some of these fielded devices they might be 10, 15 years old. The silicon may not have all the resources that it needs to properly implement or efficiently implement some of these newer standards. There are a number of, hopefully they're out of the stream by now, but there's a lot of, for instance, older Wi-Fi devices that only know how to do WEP encryption. WPE, yeah, that's the next bullet point there. WEP, wired equivalent privacy, is hopelessly broken. You can download a free sniffer tool, and within a few minutes you can break into a WEP network. And there's a lot of old devices that the Wi-Fi hardware in them simply can't do any of the modern standards like WPA2 for encryption and security. And you have to retire those devices. So sometimes it's not enough to upgrade the firmware to modern standards. Sometimes you have to upgrade the hardware. Let's see, what are some of the, next slide, please. So, I mean, in addition to just, selecting the right algorithms and such, you also have to employ them in the right way. You have to make sure that your system is designed properly for these types of threats. You have to have encryption. It's in modern day, it's not, it's simply not responsible to deploy any system where network communications over an IP network, whether it's over local Wi-Fi or whether it's across the internet to a remote cloud system, those communications need to be encrypted. And it doesn't matter if it's just a, it's just a little home automation system. We're not transporting medical data or financial data. It really doesn't matter, because any system like that is not secured, it introduces vulnerabilities that probably you probably aren't thinking about in your product, and how it can affect the other systems on a network. Incorrect configuration of hardware. That's obviously a fairly broad concept. It can be as simple as you think you're implementing such and such encryption in your embedded device, when actually it's not as strong as you think it is. The specific case I was thinking of when I wrote that line was, there is in microcontrollers and embedded systems, there's usually, when you're doing development, you're constantly, downloading new code into the device and doing interactive debugging, stopping and starting it. But when you release a product, you need to make sure that someone can't do the same things that the developer was doing in terms of reading out memory and accessing debug interfaces and things like that. You need to lock down that system and that processor to make sure that, for instance, someone can't just attach a debug probe to your processor and read out the memory. You have to, for instance, a flash microcontroller, there's usually a lock bit or similar construct where you set that bit, and that device can no longer be read out by a benchtop programmer or a debug pod. And your firmware in there is now secure. Someone can't go in there and extract that and have a deep look at your firmware.
And we've been surprised over the years how many times we see just a simple action like that is not being taken, where we see something that's being manufactured without that lock bit being set.
Poor system design, allowing unauthorized access. This really gets back to how you authenticate devices. Probably one of the most robust ways of securing devices is through the use of public key infrastructure, private key, public certificate, type of security. If you look at the cloud systems that Amazon and Azure and Google and other systems provide, they usually have some type of system where the client that is connecting to their cloud system has to present some type of certificate that attests to the authenticity of that embedded device. Now, that certificate is public, but cryptographically, that device also has the private key that corresponds to that certificate. So, for instance, in AWS, when you establish that secure TLS connection over the network, not only is the client IoT device authenticating that, yes, the cloud is who they say they are, they have a signed root certificate, you know, I can trust this cloud server. The cloud server turns around and they do client authentication through TLS when they're setting up this encrypted connection. And the client presents their certificate, and they basically attest, yes, this is my certificate. The cloud has a record of that certificate that says, yes, device 123 has this certificate assigned. And when that connection comes in, during the TLS negotiation, they can verify, yes, he presented this certificate, and cryptographically, there's no way that he could have done what he just did, you know, setting up the connection, if he didn't also have the private key for that certificate. That's how Amazon verifies that devices connect properly. Google GCP uses a slightly different method. They use JSON web tokens, where the client cryptographically generates a token and submits that as like the password to connect to the MQTT server, and the server examines that token and says, yes, this token had to have been generated by the person who was assigned this client certificate. You know, even at a most basic level, you could assign maybe a unique name and password to every IoT device, you know, that you release, and make sure that's stored in a secure part of the device that can't be extracted. So at least when a device connects to a remote system, it can at least present some sort of credentials that that prove that it is basically that you know the device is who it says it is. And also, firmware upgrade in the IoT world is honestly mandatory for any responsible system designer, because new threats appear all the time. All of these embedded systems are put together using software, sometimes from multiple vendors, and the providers of these chips and these software stacks will regularly release updates that may fix bugs down in their networking code. There may be a particular threat that was identified, and they have to release a patch to mitigate that threat. There was an incident a few years ago where there was a vulnerability found in the WPA2 protocol. It wasn't so much a bug in the protocol, but it was more that the specification was not strict enough to make sure that everyone who implemented that protocol did it in a way that couldn't be exploited. And so a lot of vendors had to go back and revise their software to make sure that their devices weren't vulnerable. If your device is not getting a regular firmware update, it is going to become a security risk. So you have to have a mechanism in place for these devices to pull down regular firmware updates so that they can stay on top of current security standards. It's also important for a lot of these devices that certainly a device that's going to be connecting to Amazon AWS, if it doesn't use just-in-time provisioning, which I won't talk about right now, if you instead provision them in the factory, where you embed a key and certificate in the factory and send it out the door, it also is going to have certificates for things like the root trust authority for connecting to remote websites and other security credentials. It may be necessary to update those credentials. There may be a certificate revocation that your device has to handle, and so you actually have to update what certificate you verify a remote system against when you connect it. You have to have a provision in your device to be able to update not only its own firmware, but also those security credentials. If they're set in stone once they leave the factory, that in itself is a vulnerability. If at a later time you realize, crap, we have to update these credentials, and we have no way of doing it. Your only option at that point is to retire the device. there are many different kind of threats that you'll find in the wild. I mean, the most simple case is some remote operator acquires a set of credentials, and obviously there's a million different ways you can do this. You can find an IoT device that has hard-coded credentials, and you discover those, or you crack the name and password from a device. Obviously, in the desktop PC world, you hear about phishing all the time, where you can get someone's domain name and password, and then you can crawl across the network and do all kinds of bad things. But honestly, a lot of the same principles that apply to desktop security also apply to IoT security. Especially considering a lot of IoT devices are not just, they're not, obscure little microcontrollers running their own custom stacks. A lot of these embedded devices are also just embedded Linux systems that run general purpose software. And if you gain access to these devices, it's relatively easy to get in there and make them do malicious things. You don't have to concoct your own special microcontroller firmware to take over the device. If you can remote into an IoT device that's a Linux device and you get a shell prompt, you're off to the races. So yeah, if the credentials for a device can be compromised, then yeah, it's game over at that point. You can have man-in-the-middle attacks, and those come about when you don't have either adequate encryption or adequate authentication. So if you had a device, for instance, just connecting blindly to some remote web server for all of its, its information and its data that it's shipping up, if you can just insert yourself in the network and pretend it to be that device at that IP address, and that device connects to you and doesn't do a proper verification of the server-side TLS certificate, then what's the point of that security? Yeah, you may have authenticated your device, but you haven't. Malicious firmware updates. You need to make sure that when a device pulls down a firmware update, that it is legitimate, and you do that through code signing. You have keys that are stored in the device that can be used to then verify that when a firmware update is pushed out, you can check the signature on that firmware update and verify that yes, this was signed by the private key that governs firmware updates. That it wasn't issued by some malicious party. Because yeah, if you don't secure your devices, we sold 1 million devices this year and they're all compromised. And guess what? They're all now part of a botnet, and they're all doing malicious things, and your name's all over the news. And also, more to remember is there's also lateral threats. Your device may be just a device of relatively low importance, but if it gives someone a foothold into a network in order to be able to then go and do other things on the network, that's also a huge threat. The fish tank in the casino is one example. Another big example that I think probably a lot of people heard about was the Target compromise, Target stores, where all of their point of sale systems were embedded with malware that was capturing card numbers and everything. That came about because Target did not segregate their point of sale systems from their HVAC systems within their stores. They were technically on the same internal network, and an HVAC vendor's system was compromised. That allowed them to then travel over the network, get at the point of sale systems, compromise those point of sale systems, and then that's how that came about.
David, we've got a question for you
Yes.
here from Gillis. Is there an easy way to detect man in the middle on small IoT devices?
The simplest way is to make sure that you have a root of trust certificate store in your device. You use it can be just a single root of trust for the one server that you're connecting to. There's a series of devices that we work with where when you build your firmware, one of the devices that gets pushed to the device is a whole catalog of root trust authorities, VeriSign, and all the big name companies that do certificate signing for websites. When you connect to a remote web server and you establish that TLS connection, that server needs to present some type of certificate, and you have to make sure that you have to make sure that you know that server is who they say they are. So that's the easiest way to eliminate man in the middle, is just do proper certificate verification when you're creating your secure connections. With specific regard to manufacturing, so some other threats that can come up is loss of intellectual property. It's great if you can manufacture your things, cheaply in various places, but if you can't assure the integrity of what it is that you're manufacturing, you could lose basically all of your intellectual property because some unscrupulous contract manufacturer decided to take that software and have a closer look at it and divine all your secrets. There's counterfeiting, where some CM could say clone the hardware design, for instance, and then either just copy your software or make their own software, pour it into the hardware, and maybe it does mostly the same thing, and they put that on the market, and now you're up against counterfeit devices. You can also have over provisioning. By that I mean you can set things up such that when you program devices during manufacturing, you can set your programmer to say, I want to produce 25,000 units and not 1 unit more, and the device will program that many units. If you don't have that type of system in place, you might order 25,000 units from a CM, but what you don't know is that, they snuck off to the side and they built 5,000 more and kind of sold them, for themselves. And of course, that's, pure illegal profit to that unscrupulous CM. And then also, you have to be careful of insecure provisioning. When you are provisioning these devices, you need to make sure that the security credentials that are being put into these devices are not immediately compromised at the moment that you're putting these secure credentials into all these embedded devices. If your manufacturer system is communicating with an offsite system like a cloud server to assist with manufacturing and provisioning, those communications need to be secured. It's not enough to just secure your end device. The whole process of manufacturing these devices needs to be secured. So,
well, how about that? That's a lot to worry about, obviously, but again, thanks, David, for going through the vulnerabilities that we can see out there. So as you can see, as a result of all these kinds of vulnerabilities, it's still a little bit of a wild west out there, but the regulations are coming, and they're coming quickly. So in January of 2020, California adopted SB 327, which is a set of IoT security regulations. The FDA has issued guidance in terms of medical products and how they are to be treated. The Industrial Internet Consortium has come along with a set of policies and tests and guidelines. IoT Security Foundation, UL has even jumped into the game in terms of being able to provide security scan and assurance. And NIST is also another organization. I'm sure there are many more. So there are definitely active efforts out there to ward off the threat and have some sense of standardization about how to bring products to market so that there can be, trust and security. Next chart, please. So we touched on a little bit about of manufacturing the secure products. David talked a little bit about it, but let's go up to a high level and then come back down to some details again. So it's important to realize that IoT security exists throughout the product life cycle. And it's something, charts may be a little hard to see there, but it starts in development. Somebody is developing something, and there are certain things that are done in development that then carry over to manufacturing and provisioning and commissioning systems. Those systems are then deployed in the field. Sometimes the tools, techniques, and everything that are used there are different, of course, than in manufacturing. We then go into a support phase. During a support phase, units break and have to be replaced and all of this. So there's security issues that come into play there. And then lastly, there's decommissioning. One of the worst things you can do is leave an insecure system out in the field that just provides an entry point for a bad actor. So it's important to realize that as a contract manufacturer working with a contract manufacturer, that's just one element of the overall picture. Next chart. So what is the role of the contract manufacturer in this whole thing? So as I just said, you're a member of a complex ecosystem, but ultimately the responsibility lies with the OEM, the designer of the system, and to really establish and audit the contract manufacturer to the established processes and procedures. And these all have to be based on a risk assessment that's done by that OEM to make sure that everything is being done appropriate to the task. The contract manufacturer also has to be able to manage a complex set of suppliers, contractors, other downstream suppliers, because you're buying program parts maybe from other people and everything, and you have to make sure that that whole thing is being managed appropriately. And then lastly, as some of these IoT regulations come to the forefront, just like many contract manufacturers maintain UL listings and things like that, we'll probably see the same sort of things start to occur for the IT side of IoT, if you will. So how do we secure the IoT? Digital certificates are one of the ways that are used, one of the most common ways of using to securely tag an IoT device. And as David indicated, the public key infrastructure, PKI, is also used. PKI has been used for years and years in the internet. It's very well understood, trusted. That framework is very appropriate to the task for IoT. Also important is it has a small footprint because, as David alluded to earlier, many of these applications we're talking about are small microcontrollers that have a very small capacity in terms of memory and processing. So it's important to make sure that any security approach considers that. So what's really occurring in manufacturing these days is something that's referred to as zero trust manufacturing. And that approach assumes that nothing, absolutely nothing in the supply chain can be trusted, and that everything has to be locked down and under control. So it's a series of processes and steps to make sure that that's the case. The concept of zero trust manufacturing was originated by Forrester back in 2010. Few years later, Google jumped on board, and then the rest of industry at large got involved as well. Zero trust manufacturing is not a point level solution. Like quality, a lot of people like to think you can just kind of pour it in at the end as the last step in manufacturing. So like quality, it has to be built in. It has to be sort of a holistic approach that you take to it in order to get the results. But by taking those steps, you can ensure that throughout the product life cycle, you can guarantee the firmware that the data and the digital credentials are what they need to be in order to be safe and secure. So I'm going to ask David to walk through, really it's kind of a summary of what you talked through on the vulnerabilities, and a quick, manufacturing checklist for you. So if you're producing devices at a contract manufacturer, hopefully that contract manufacturer is RBB. If you're producing those devices, you'll want to make sure that the kind of things that are on this list are being addressed. So David, why don't we walk through that list, starting with hardware security?
Yeah, I mean, the most basic thing is making sure that your device is locked down so that someone can't get into it and extract your firmware, extract your keys, do anything else to compromise that device. It can be as simple as setting a lock bit on a simple flash microcontroller, but more often it involves especially for Linux systems and such. There's, usually you have an open network interface on that device. That's a very large attack surface. So you have to make sure that device is properly locked down so that you can only have legitimate access to that device when it's out in the field. It's not enough to just have we got this little back door over here just in case we need to send them it. No, any back door will be discovered. You just have to assume that.
And it sounds obvious, but it's one of those things that rule gets broken more often than not, it seems. So it's an obvious one, but it's one you have to make sure. So then the second one kind of dovetails.
Yeah, I briefly mentioned this earlier. I guess I will talk about just a little bit. Generation of keys on the device itself. So you can set up, for instance, an Amazon AWS IoT system where you generate, say you have just a manufacturing PC and you generate a private key and a public certificate, and you push both that key and certificate into the device, and then you take that certificate, which is public, and you ship that up to the AWS cloud. And now, now the two parties should know who each other are. But you can also do what's called just-in-time provisioning, where you have you still have to embed some small credential into the device, but the device can actually essentially onboard itself. It can connect for the first time with the cloud, say, yes, I am a brand new device, number 123. Please, join me to your system. And the cloud will then generate the appropriate keys. The device will store those keys. And so you don't necessarily have to have a complicated scheme where you are handing out keys to individual devices in the factory. You could instead burn a uniform image into every device, and you still have to serialize them somehow. But then those devices can onboard themselves and generate their own keys for connecting to the cloud service.
So then it's also important, obviously, to have some kind of a lifecycle management process for those keys, and there are standards that are emerging on how that is to be done, but again, it's something that needs to be agreed upon between the OEM and the contract manufacturer. We're running a little short on time, so rather than go through each of the items here, is there anything else you wanted to draw attention to on that list?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about the importance of encryption, both for device to cloud, but also manufacturing system to cloud.
Mm-hmm.
All of the certificates for the device, you have to make sure that the device has not only its authentication certificates for itself, but also all the appropriate certificates for connecting to remote systems, for authenticating firmware updates that come down from the cloud. You have to make sure that you have a system in place to potentially update or replace those certificates if those need to be changed, or if there's a compromise, for instance. Mutual authentication, not just I know that the site I'm connecting to is good, but that your cloud site knows that it's a genuine device that's connecting. And also, just from a business process standpoint, make sure that you have a proper and firm process in place for producing your final firmware images and then doing a proper code signing and release. It's not enough just to say, well, I compiled the firmware, here's your hex file, off you go. You've got to have a bona fide process of packaging that firmware into some type of secure container, putting a signature on it, and releasing that for manufacturing new units that are in-house, as well as releasing that to whatever system you have in place for distributing firmware updates to the field.
Excellent. Thank you, David. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to have one of our systems engineers, Antonio Guglielmi, show a real example of a board that has multiple controllers and firmware on it, and talk a little bit about the process that goes on in manufacturing and provisioning of this board. So, Antonio, if you want to kind of come around this.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. As Ed mentioned, my name is Antonio Guglielmi, hardware engineer and systems engineer here at Logisync. So what I have here is a board that was developed here at Logisync in particular, and this happens to have multiple processors on it, one being a Wi-Fi processor, another being a microcontroller, which happens to be a Kinetis-based part in that case. And then we have a Zigbee module over on the other end of the board. So you have three processors on this board that obviously have to work together in harmony, not only to function, but also perform any type of firmware updates and loading keys and whatnot during manufacturing time. So in this particular case, each processor can be loaded individually using programming tools that are designed for production environments, such as the Cyclone. And in particular, you'll be able to hook up to each processor individually, program that part with whatever secure image was loaded into that cyclone. And then from there, the parts would then be loaded with code, but they're not necessarily ready for manufacturing or for deployment in that case. You would then have to load in commissioning scripts and you have to use commissioning scripts to load in keys and credentials that you need for the actual product itself. And that's done in multiple ways. But on this particular design, it's done over a UART port, which then allows the keys to be entered in through that port through a manufacturing tool, which that tool then can access the cloud. And if it has to obtain any type of permissions or keys from the online cloud site, it's able to do that. And then it's able to push those keys into the unit. Now, for this particular product, there are several different keys that get loaded in for several different provisions that happen. In particular, one that generates a public and private key, for instance, the private key is actually removed from the PC locally, and it's removed so that the manufacturer doesn't maintain the log of those keys.
Yeah, that's important. When you generate a private and public key pair, if you're generating a key pair and then transferring that to a remote system, there is no reason for any device other than the target device to hold that private key. Any other system should throw that private key away, because you know, again, if someone grabs the private key, they can impersonate that system and it's game over. The only device that needs it is that end device.
Sure. Yep.
We got a question for you here. Is this like a TPM or HSM embedded into the motherboard via the cloud?
That is one way that that devices can store these secure credentials. Another way, for instance, that Wi-Fi device that's on there, there is a ROM bootloader in there that has all of the logic and program necessary to, when it boots itself up, it looks at its onboard flash, which is organized like a file system, and it cryptographically verifies each of the components, the main firmware, any of the other certificates that it needs to access, and verifies that those are in fact valid before it'll actually boot itself. So the firmware for that processor is highly secure, in that when you put keys into that device, into the flash of that device, there is no way to read out those keys. So it performs essentially the same function as if you had a separate processor like a PC, and then you attached a trusted platform module. There are also crypto chip coprocessor chips that you can attach to many other processes. Like, you know, we've often used NXP processors. They have a part called the Edge Lock SEO 50, which has the same capabilities of storing cryptographic keys. For smaller microcontrollers, Microchip makes the ECC 608 that also performs a lot of those similar functions.
Got
Yep.
one more question.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is the footprint of that security firmware?
It's relatively small. I mean, I can produce an entire working image for that Wi-Fi processor that knows how to do TLS encryption and authentication, and the space of probably about 150 kilobytes. You know, you don't need a multi-megabyte base of software in order to be able to do these things. If you have a security coprocessor, such as, you know, like the ECC 608, for instance, part of that coprocessor's function is not only to store keys, but also to perform certain cryptographic functions and to do verification. You can submit a signature to that device and say, is this valid? And that device can actually offload a lot of the software that the host processor would otherwise need. So you can actually do you can have secure microcontroller applications that fit in much less weight, you know, much less than a megabyte of flash.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So going along with this board, everything that's loaded in manufacturing time facilitates application level operation as well as firmware update operation. Now, in the instance that something needed to be loaded not from a cloud site, but need to be loaded remotely, say for some type of quick reprogramming effort, maybe in the factory, or some reprogramming effort in the field directly. There's also security with images that are pushed locally to the device. And the way the process would work is, in this particular case, the images would be verified by one central processor, which then will distribute those images to the appropriate device. And if there's other upstream devices, say, that are connected over Zigbee, the same will be true for those as well. So the images are not only secure, and the process is not only secure from the standpoint of over-the-air updates, but also local updates.
Yeah, the images are encrypted so that someone can't just take the raw image and be able to decode your firmware. And they are also authenticated. If that image was not generated with the correct key, then that the image simply will not deploy.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Thanks, Antonio. So we're running a little bit long here. I wanted to open up the floor for some additional questions. Just a few summary comments, though. Obviously, like we said earlier, the benefits of this technology are real. Our goal wasn't to scare everybody into never developing an IoT system here, but those threats are real also. It's tricky to navigate that ecosystem. OEMs ultimately own that responsibility. But I think the most important thing to realize is the technology and expertise exists out there to properly secure and ship these kinds of systems. It's like anything, it requires a commitment to do it and to do it right, to make sure that there isn't any liability being incurred as a result of products that are being shipped. So I'd like to thank RBB for allowing us to provide this presentation today. And let's open it up for some questions.
We've got two questions right off the bat that we hadn't gotten to. The first one being, are there best practices regarding rolling out cybersecurity best practices to suppliers?
Yes, there are. And some of those are codified standards. And that's part of what UL and some of the others are looking at, very much so.
And then the last one, is there an inexpensive way to ensure that all devices have a separate unique identifier built in during fabrication?
There's a few different ways of doing that. I mean, if you don't want to imbue a unique serial number into each device as part of the manufacturing process, certain memory chips, for instance, certain EEPROM devices, you can order a certain part number, and in addition to having the EEPROM memory, they will also have a 128 or 256 bit unique serial number built into those devices. So immediately upon manufacturing, yeah, all the devices, they all have the same chips, but each of those chips each have different unique numeric identifiers in them, and you can use that as part of your serialization process. You can, if it probably would make sense to, for instance, during the manufacturing process, register those unique numbers that are embedded in each device. So yeah, you can purchase devices that are already serialized if you don't want to make software serialization a part of your process. You can also do things like oftentimes networking addresses. Wi-Fi devices in particular always come with their own MAC address. So that's a cheap and easy way of differentiating one device from another. Every Wi-Fi device has to have a global unique MAC address. And just a side note, an important thing to understand is when you manufacture an Ethernet device, usually it is the OEM that must provide the MAC address for Ethernet devices. If you purchase a piece of Ethernet silicon, the chip vendor is not going to give you a MAC address. You have to provision those from somewhere, whether you purchase a small block from some company or you go and get a whole new block from IEEE. But Wi-Fi devices, Bluetooth, Zigbee, all those type of devices, those are always provided with MAC addresses from the module manufacturer, so you don't have to worry about provisioning those.